Like, we are running an experiment that is unprecedented, and in a singularity, the laws of physics break down, and you can't predict what happens on the other side of that singularity. And we believe we're about to run that experiment here. Look, the U.S. dollar might be the reserve currency, but U.S. Treasuries are the reserve asset, and they used to be known as a neutral reserve asset, to quote a phrase from our friend Luke Roman. And we believe that the trend is that gold will replace Treasuries slowly at first, and perhaps suddenly all at once, as that neutral reserve asset, i.e. the asset that is used to settle imbalances in international trade. And in order for gold to serve that role, the combined market cap of gold needs to be much higher than it is today.
Welcome back to Metals and Miners. I'm its founder and its host, Gary Bohm. We have a fantastic discussion lined up today, and I'm very excited about it. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Doomberg. He is the publisher of the Doomberg Substack, which highlights the fundamentals missing from many economic and policy decisions. The publication has quickly grown to be one of the most widely read, if not the #1 finance newsletter on Substack. The publication is their 100% passion, and the content is born out of their team's deep expert experience in heavy industry, private equity, and the hard sciences. Family offices and C-suite executives hire them to deliver innovative thinking and clarity to complex problems, and we are so excited that Doomberg is here with us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Gary, with an introduction like that, I mean, what can I say? It's been a long time coming. Really looking forward to it. I know we were joking before we hit record. This is one that we're both very much excited to get done. So again, real pleasure to be here. Looking forward to talking with you for the next hour.
Wonderful. All right. Well, let's begin with the economy. What would you point to that has you super bullish on the economy over the next 3 to 5 years? And what would you point to that has you super bearish in the same time period? And in your analysis, which one do you think has the higher probability of winning out?
Yeah, great question. And I think first thing you need to decide is, are you talking about the U.S. economy or are you talking about the global economy? If we look at the U.S. economy, obviously the energy glut in the U.S. Is driving economic resilience that I don't think few people had on their radar, especially in the face of the Fed aggressively hiking interest rates and keeping them higher for longer than the market has generally predicted. Around the world, it's a different story. Depends on which region you are. Of course, Europe is still reeling from the echoes of the energy crisis, and Germany in particular is in the process of deindustrialization. As macro analysts, the fundamental question we always think is the most important one, and that not enough people ask, is what is the state of the primary energy markets? And if you ask us right now, the primary energy markets are relatively well supplied. Natural gas is in a glut, especially in the U.S. Diesel inventories are seasonally high. Crack spreads are low. The only risk on the board, to the bear side of things, is war and geopolitics. We think that an escalatory misunderstanding could lead to significant economic shocks. Oil $150, $200, significant inflation, and so on. And so we're bearish about geopolitics, and if everything sort of settles down, if peace were to break out in the Middle East, if peace were to break out in the war in Ukraine, I think oil prices could fall substantially from where they are. We could get into our best effort to try and model what the geopolitical risk premium is, for example. But overall, especially in the U.S., with primary energy very well supplied, the AI boom is real. I think, by and large, the U.S. will avoid a recession, at least up until the election, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so there's a few data points in there that I definitely want to cover with you, but I want to first touch on the U.S. consumer. They've run out of excess savings from the pandemic stimulus era. The historical savings rate is close to 8%, and today it's down to around 3%, which is a multi-generational low. At the same time, credit card debt is higher than ever before, and the kicker is that Americans are willing to pay 20 to 25% interest on the debt, which makes little sense in a vacuum, but a lot of sense when considering the higher for longer inflationary environment that we've been in. Doomberg, how long can the consumer hold on here in this inflationary environment, what do you see happening for the 70% of the U.S. economy over the next 12 or so months with those data points as a backdrop?
Yeah, there's a couple of counterpoints to that, and most obvious one on our board is natural gas is still dirt cheap, $12 a barrel, oil equivalent on an energy content basis. That's a huge stimulus for the consumer. Power bills down, heating bills down. Price of gasoline is pretty reasonable right now. For sure, the consumer is struggling, but I think the counterweight to that is the fact that the U.S. is swimming in a sea of cheap, abundant hydrocarbons, and on top of that, the government is running huge fiscal deficits, and then on top of that, 5% interest rates are basically stimmies for rich people, and so there are pockets of the economy that are going to be struggling. There always are, but integrated across the economy as measured in GDP. And there's lots of debate about whether the government is fudging the numbers in an election year and all of those things. In our view, cheap energy, fiscal stimulus, indirect sort of stimulus in the form of you can actually get a yield in a money market fund now. And there's a lot of people who invest and so on. And so yes, you can find pockets in the economy, and look at that. There's going to be a recession. Like the economy is cyclical. We've had a pretty good post-COVID run. There will inevitably be an economic contraction on the horizon. Do I think it's 2024 in the U.S.? Probably not. When it comes, do I think it's going to be severe? Absolutely. Are we snowplowing problems ahead of the shovel? Of course. Is $1 trillion in debt every 90 days sustainable? No. And so all of those things are real. It all depends on your time frame. Like if I'm looking 3 to 6 months out, which is what matters for the election, I think the Fed can extend and pretend, and we're going to spend our way to a relatively robust economy. And there's a manufacturing resurgence. I think the Department of Defense is keenly interested in reshoring and nearshoring and friendshoring, and we're seeing sort of a manufacturing construction boom, which will eventually make its way into manufacturing job bursts. I just think with so much of the U.S. economy tied into natural gas, people don't realize like every heavy industry that matters basically runs their sites on cogeneration facilities, which burn natural gas to make both electricity and heat. We're at $2 a million BTU Henry Hub right now, and negative prices in the beating heart of the Permian Basin. It's just hard to see how that is a recipe that bakes a recession cake. We could be wrong. We made a call earlier this year called Slick Landing, where we predicted there would be no recession in 2024. We got some pushback for that, which is fine and natural and healthy. And if we're wrong, we'll be the first to admit it and try to figure out why, which is what you do as an analyst. But I think the consumer is certainly struggling. I think inflation is hitting the economically disadvantaged disproportionately, as it always does. The rich have ways to hedge against inflation that those who are struggling don't. I think on the bearish side, I think political unrest in the U.S. is the base case. I don't know how we get through the election without half the country not believing the results, and I don't think that's very good. And so post-election, all bets are off. I think recession risk is very high. I think the disputed election is almost a certainty. You have Trump on trial and can only campaign on Wednesdays. It's just you couldn't make it up. Like this is not how you imagine the U.S. political situation unfolding.
Yeah, it's an absolute movie.
Yeah.
So on the nearshoring, friendshoring, for decades we've been leveraging China for just about all of our various manufacturing processes, and now, as geopolitical turmoil heats up with them, we're beginning to move away. And like you said, we're starting to invest here in the homeland and also look to other partners. Isn't all of that inflationary though?
Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, well, look, when you can't repay your debts, you either default or inflate, and the U.S. is not going to default. And so we can't pay back our debts. And so we're going to inflate. Look, I mean, I own a ton of gold. I own a ton of land. I own a ton of collectibles. I'm hedged. And by the way, gold is the one asset I own that it bothers me when it goes up too quickly, because that usually foretells darker things in the economy. I don't own gold as an investment. I own gold as a hedge and a liquidity source during a crisis, and I treat it as such. So when I don't even actually look at the price of gold other than as an indication for the weakness of the dollar. I view my gold holdings as look, 20 gold eagles will buy you a nice mid-size SUV today, and in 15 years, 20 gold eagles will buy you a nice mid-size SUV. Like that's what gold does. Gold is not a vehicle for speculation. Gold is a vehicle for savings, and excess savings for us are swept into real assets. And gold is a key part of that. For some people, it's Bitcoin. For some people, it's artwork. I happen to like watches, and I know the market well, and I know my local land area well. So I like, local knowledge in hedging against inflation is important. But yeah, I think we are absolutely headed for a period of inflation. I think the challenges with the shipping in the Middle East, causing all of the rerouting of these container ships, is going to find its way into prices. I think the Fed is going to be forced to keep rates higher for longer, unless it looks like Trump is going to win, at which point I expect the Fed to get overtly political and to cut into the election. All of Washington, D.C. is oriented around keeping the orange man out of the White House. And that's just the pieces on the board. That's not a political statement. I think as an analyst, that's undeniable that that's what's going on. Yeah. And so, it's again, I think we'll have a summer of relative quiet. I would keep a couple of milestones on people's boards for geopolitical risk and inflation and all of these things. One is Zelensky's term in Ukraine technically ends on May 21st. This is underreported in the West. He will, continue to claim to be president, but to the Russians, I think that is a pretty important date, and that might cause some issues, let's just say. But also the Democratic Convention in Chicago this August is going to be potentially a real fiasco, especially with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. President Biden seems to have painted himself in a real corner here. Lots of ways we can go with this, Gary, but the world has never been more interesting.
Yeah. Interesting is one way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah. So, back to the inflationary pressures, given all of those ongoing pressures, what are your views on the Federal Reserve's approach so far to managing interest rates, monetary policy, et cetera? And what changes, if any, are you anticipating between now and the election? It sounds to me like maybe you're expecting it all to come post-election.
So it's really amazing to see how the market routinely and regularly underestimates what Jerome Powell's going to do. They have undersold the extent to which he was willing to raise rates, and they have oversold the speed with which they assumed he would have to cut.
Yes.
And perpetually, even today, the markets are catching up to what the Fed is trying to tell them what to do, which is something we've observed for the past 18 months. And if you had just listened to Jerome Powell and traded, interest rates accordingly, you'd have made a ton of money. Like, he has done what he has said he is going to do. Take the man literally.
A little hard, though, after his transitory.
Yes, of course. But I say, like, after the second or third time that the market got it so wrong, you could have made a lot of money trading derivatives and interest rates. Not that we do, and not that we would recommend it. But nonetheless, I think as long as it looks like the election is close enough that the big cities will come through for Biden, wink, wink, I think you'll see that Jerome Powell will keep rates as high as he can for as long as he can, because inflation is not yet defeated. That's just real.
Yeah. So you wrote in a recent piece called Broken Record on July 19th, 2022, a group of economics professors from Yale, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Warsaw School of Economics, they self-published a 118-page non-peer-reviewed article titled "Business Retreats and Sanctions Are Crippling the Russian Economy." It was formatted to give the appearance of a rigorous academic study that one might find in a prestigious journal, but the authors painted a dim picture of life in Russia in the aftermath of President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But let's be honest, it's been a complete that's 180 from reality. So how could these brilliant economic professors and also the current administration get this one so completely wrong? And why would they mislead, either purposefully or unrealizing, the general public on this so badly?
Yeah, so just to be clear, the piece we published, Broken Record, came out yesterday, and it's free to all subscribers. And the paper that we referenced and that you read was published in 2022. And around that same time, in fact, a few weeks before they put out their paper, we published a piece called Crazy Pills, where we predicted that not only would the sanctions not work, but they would backfire.
Yeah.
And this is one of the great mysteries of our time, Gary. I happen to know the lead author of that study, at least peripherally. He wouldn't remember me, and back in my days in the commodity sector, I happened to have dinner with him. And if you'd have asked me to name 10,000 people who would lead a 118-page economic study about the situation in Russia vis-a-vis sanctions, I would not have gotten to Professor Jeff Sonnenschein at Yale, given 10,000 attempts. And yet here he was, the lead author of this study, which really caught our eye. It was 100% stone cold, dead to nuts wrong in every way, as we laid out in that piece, again, which is free to everybody. So if you're listening and you want to get a sample for the type of writing we do, Broken Record at newsletter.doomberg.com is free for everybody to read.
I'll put the link up
great.
on right there in the video. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a great mystery. Like, we saw this from a mile, like weeks into the war. We predicted the sanctions would backfire. We caught a lot of heat for that, but we were right. Here's the fundamental issue. You can't sanction a major commodity player's volume and expect to reduce their revenue. Anybody who spent 5 minutes in the commodity sector, and clearly nobody in government has, understands that you make all your money during price spikes. And the price elasticity of demand for oil is such that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% supply deficits double and triple and quadruple the price. So here's the thought experiment we wrote in Crazy Pills all the way back in 2022, ahead of this study, quote unquote, from Yale. Imagine we were successful and we walled off all of Russia's oil from reaching the markets. What do you think would happen to the price of oil? It would go up to $400 or $500 a barrel. It would crash the global economy. People would starve. Now, imagine we're successful and we cut half of Russia's exports from the markets. The price of oil is going to more than double, and he will make more revenue. The only way to impact Putin's revenue, if that is your goal, is to flood the market with commodities and drive the price lower, because there's only so much he can produce. If oil is $100 a barrel, he's going to make 5 times as much money. Well, actually, 5 times as much revenue than if oil is at $20 a barrel. And at $20 a barrel, he's probably losing money. And there's a way to bring the price of oil down. It's to pump more. James Baker did this before the first Gulf War. Ronald Reagan did this and broke the back of the Soviets in partnership with the Saudis in the 80s. This is a playbook that's known. It doesn't take much. Here's a great example. Joe Biden released, controversially, and in a raw political move ahead of the midterm election, it must be said, he released 1 million barrels a day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for 6 months. Yeah. That's 1% of daily supply over that period, or 0.5% of global demand for the year. The price of oil got cut in half.
Right.
It doesn't take much. Produce. Get rid of environmental regulations. Go around the world and lean on your allies and your foes to produce. Lift the sanctions on Iran. Lift the sanctions on Venezuela. Lean on Australia and Canada to flood the market with commodities, with coal, with natural gas, with oil. It wouldn't take much. We saw what happened with oil when COVID happened, minus $37 a barrel. How long do you think Putin could stand $10 a barrel of oil? Not very long.
So we have so many military experts, advisors, historians that are there assisting the administration. It just really begs the question why they would come out and they would also have, really highly prestigious people like this from Yale and UPenn, et cetera, to what looks to be propagandizing.
Yes, that's the word that I would use. It was a puff piece of propaganda. I mean, let's be clear, as we said in the piece.
So why is that happening?
Look, anytime you're at war, you have to proactively manage public opinion. I mean, no combatant in a war, and we're at war. I mean, if you read the Russian propaganda and the Chinese propaganda, and we have, because we just did a Doom Zoom for our pro tier on geopolitics and war, where we gave our assessment of the situation and the risks involved. If you read the Russian newspapers and you read the Chinese newspapers, they are describing this internally as World War III. They are at war with the U.S. Yeah. They are at war with the West. And we're not internally. This is a faraway, sometimes it shows up on CNN and MSNBC, but it isn't really impacting the daily lives of Americans or Canadians, Australians, in the way that it is the Russians and the Chinese. And they are at war, and they are treating it accordingly. And by the way, one of the things we said in that pro-tier talk is there's a reason why we care so much about nuclear proliferation. Because once a country gets nuclear weapons, you have to treat them differently.
Right.
Russia has the largest and most technically sophisticated stockpile of nuclear weapons on Earth. And this whole dangerous analogy of you don't want to be a Chamberlain and you'd rather be Churchill. Look, if France and Germany had nuclear weapons and the UK had nuclear weapons, do you think World War II would have unfolded the way it did? Of course not. Putin has nuclear weapons. This is an existential fight for Putin. You cannot win, quote unquote, a kinetic war with a nuclear superpower. You can only provoke them into using their nuclear weapons. Why this is lost on people boggles the mind. I don't know what we're doing. What are we doing, Pierre? You tell me.
Yeah, well, so clearly the American public, though, is the collateral damage in this whole process. But Doomberg, as the world is transitioning from a unipolar to a multipolar world, trade relationships are bifurcating. Where we once had easy access to critical commodities, there's now incredible competition for them. And in some cases, we're all but shut out from access to them due to their production being in what is now a hostile country to the U.S. For instance, graphite or rare earths in China. Beyond price inflation, what else does the new commodity supply chain that's occurring in this world mean for the U.S.? You've touched on war. Is that really, what's on tap here? What do you see?
Well, it's funny because in that same presentation, we described China rather cheekily, but if you think about it, it's true. China is the new arsenal of democracy because all of the democracies have outsourced key parts of their military supply chains to China. And we just assume, rather stupidly, to be honest, that they'll just keep supplying us this stuff if we go to war with them. Like, I don't get it. Like how, as you said, there's many, many brilliant people in the Department of Defense. There's many brilliant people in DC, think tanks. I don't know how they don't see this. Now, I think there are some very smart people who do see this and are urging caution. But our political leaders and the neocons and the Lindsey Grahams of the world who are calling for carpet bombing of Iranian refineries as though like this is just going to go unresponded to. Like in Lindsey Graham's world, nobody ever punches back.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's just so bizarre to me. Like we are sleeping.
The ways they could punch back these days are endless.
They can hurt. Like one of the reasons why you don't get into a fight is because you might lose it. So the analogy I would use, like, Gary, if you and I walk into a bar and there's a 6'6" strapping guy at the bar and his t-shirt is cut at the sleeves and he's wearing a Hell's Angels jacket and he's got tattoos and he's ripped and he's clearly had a few drinks and he says, anybody sits in this stool next to me, I'm gonna take care of you. You and I might think twice about whether we'd go sit next to that stool. Like might is right is one of the geopolitical inputs into game theory, right? I mean, you have to assess the strength of your potential enemy before you decide whether you want to walk up and spit in their face or punch their nose. We see Blinken going to China last week to warn and threaten the Chinese on we're going to sanction them because they're helping the Russians. And the Chinese laughed at him and they sent him home and they dared him to do something about it.
They didn't even walk.
They didn't even show up at the airport, right? It's incredible. Can you imagine James Baker getting that treatment? Can you imagine Henry Kissinger getting that treatment?
No way.
Of course not. And so, but why we did this to ourselves? Like, by the way, we are deeply patriotic. We love America. The future of America is very bright. We have enormous advantages. We have a ruling class of idiots in DC right now that will be eventually wiped away or they'll just literally die off because they're all in their late 80s and 90s. And the rebirth of the US is something we want to participate in. But today, I mean, what are we doing? Like China controls magnesium. Without magnesium, you can't make aluminum composites. Without those composites, you can't make cars. Do we want to make cars?
Yeah.
The rare earths, like electric vehicles, they own 98% of the key parts of the solar supply chain. You name it. And by the way, as we wrote in a recent piece, they're going to crack the semiconductor mystery. Like I've seen this movie before.
Right.
They're going to win the semiconductor war. We're going to lose the semiconductor war as measured by our desire to stop China from being able to be self-sufficient in semiconductors. A piece we wrote last week called Chip Shot, if you're interested to read on that. And they use a very standard playbook. They trick or cajole Western companies into giving up all their IP. They steal the rest. They combine it all in some new magical company that then becomes a world beater. We're seeing electric vehicles today. BYD has a $10,000 electric vehicle that can go 200 miles. There's just no way the automakers can compete against that.
No. So China's been very smart in how they've gone about it, and the Western world has really not been very smart. They've looked at the dollar sign only, and it's now looking like the chickens are going to come home to roost. Let's go back to Russia for a second. The sanctions on Russia and the confiscation of their U.S. Treasury bonds has really put the U.S. in a tough spot to sell their bonds to foreign countries, as those foreign countries are now looking at this and saying, what happens if the U.S. doesn't agree with us in 3, 5, 10 years with what we're doing? Will they confiscate our bonds as well? So why should we store our reserves in their bonds that have all this counterparty risk? So they've been choosing gold. Central banks are buying record amounts of gold over the last 3 years. What do you see the U.S. doing to ensure the proper functioning of the U.S. bond market in light of this situation of their own doing? And how will those actions, what kind of ramifications will those actions have?
Yeah, it's the question of the day, isn't it? Especially for gold bugs like you and me. It's again, the same people who assumed that we could browbeat and threaten China with sanctions when they were holding, 4 aces and we got 7 deuce offsuit. It doesn't instill a lot of confidence that we're going to get this right. In the days after the freezing of the Russian reserves was announced, we wrote a piece, I believe it was called On the Cusp of an Economic Singularity. Like, we are running an experiment that is unprecedented, and in a singularity, the laws of physics break down and you can't predict what happens on the other side of that singularity. And we believe we're about to run that experiment here. Look, the US dollar might be the reserve currency, but US Treasuries are the reserve asset, and they used to be known as a neutral reserve asset, to quote a phrase from our friend Luke Roman. And we believe that the trend is that gold will replace Treasuries slowly at first, and perhaps suddenly all at once, as that neutral reserve asset, i.e. the asset that is used to settle imbalances in international trade. And in order for gold to serve that role, the combined market cap of gold needs to be much higher than it is today, i.e. the dollar price of gold is not going to be $2,300 if the world decides that gold is going to be the neutral reserve asset for settling of imbalances in international trade. We're long gold, full disclosure, a lot of physical, and also in the form of the Sprott Physical Gold Trust. So everybody should know. Maybe you will assume that we're talking our books, but I'd like to disclose when, on the rare occasions where we do have a financial interest in what we're discussing. But I don't think that Doomberg holding gold is going to move the gold markets. But one of the things that we're watching very closely is the premium in China to New York and London for physical delivery of gold. That has come down a bit, which explains some of the relative weakness in gold in the past few weeks. But the Chinese basically control the price of gold, in our view, and they're systematically calling the bluff of the sort of paper gold market, because if the price of gold is being suppressed in the West, then China will just stand for delivery of it. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the emptying of the ETF vaults, and all that gold's going to China.
So, yeah, before we head over to gold and commodities in general, Doomberg, it seems that all governments do is cater to their electorate. They pledge and they spend ridiculous amounts of money, and at the same time, no one really wants to pay taxes. There are massive increases in entitlements, defense spending, and interest payments on the debt. It's all leading to this record non-wartime deficits that everyone is talking about. No politician anywhere, though, is talking about austerity. Nobody. Yet we have the largest non-wartime deficit in history. My question is a huge currency devaluation coming?
It almost has to. There's all this talk. Again, credit to Luke Roman, who put this into my mind, at least. As I read his stuff. And by the way, if anybody's interested, Forest for the Trees is Luke Roman's brilliant weekly newsletter for retail.
I just had him on a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, great guy, and I always want to give credit where credit is due and where ideas come from, and he's a great source of ideas for us, and I think vice versa, he reads our stuff as well. But this fiscal dominance that we're going through. Like, who in the right mind thinks that this is a healthy situation to be running such deficits? At $1 trillion in interest, right, per year. I mean, I'm old enough to remember. Well, not quite, but I was a young child when we ran our first $1 trillion budget.
Right.
It's just I don't know how this ends. I mean, I guess we all know how it ends. This is why when we observe rampant speculation in the market, we wonder whether we're seeing a carbon copy of the famous book When Money Dies, which captures the insanities around the Weimar Republic and the hyperinflation. Mm-hmm. When you see Dogecoin trading for, tens of billions of dollars of market cap, and you see, Nvidia moving $100 billion intraday, like a billion used to be a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so, we are running a very dangerous experiment. That's all I can say. And we have this, this thinking that we can just print money with no consequence. Now, it is, I think, the first time that the global reserve currency is hyperinflating. And so this is, in a way, it is different this time. Whether that meaningfully changes the outcome remains to be seen. Like, why do we tax if we can just print?
That's a good question.
Yeah, like, why don't we just print?
I'm going to shift us over to commodities and begin with oil. Given the recent geopolitical developments that we've been discussing and the shifts in global demand, how do you anticipate oil prices will trend over the next 12 to 18 months? I want to point everyone over to our Substack. It's free. Go to metalsandminers.substack.com. We post free content on the consumer, economy, markets, artificial intelligence, individual metals and miners, and all the expert interviews that we conduct. And when you subscribe, we want to give you a free gift. It's a report that we wrote. It's based on the important Ray Dalio foundational premise. It's titled, "If You Don't Own Gold, You Know Neither History Nor Economics." This free gift is a must read for everyone on why we all should own gold. So head over to metalsandminers.substack.com, put in your email address to subscribe, and receive this free gift on us.